In our first video for Chapter 8, we looked at kind of the basic definitions of just what a state is, what is not a state, and we just kind of talked about those ideas, in comparison to, the United States and like Minnesota and things like that. So in this next one, now we're going to talk about more specific types of, state organizations in terms of, what we consider like multi-ethnic states, nation states, things of that nature. All right, so that's going to be where we're going to begin, and that'll connect us to other issues within the idea of, ethnicity, going back to Chapter 7. So here is what we consider to be when is a state and when is it not. When is a state and when is it not a state? So one of these definitions here is really important. So we talk about, a state is, a sovereign location that, controls its internal and external affairs, no foreign involvement, so they're sovereign, and it is, a country within its own political boundaries. So the idea of a nation state, and this is connecting to the idea of ethnicity. States whose territories correspond to that occupied by a particular group. Now, because of globalization, because of migration, and just human movement, there is no country on Earth that is 100% homogenous of any one particular ethnicity anymore. I'm not even sure for a very long time how well that would have existed even before the last 500 years. But at this point, there is no country that is 100% any one ethnicity. Okay? There are some that are still predominantly made up, though, of one ethnic group. And so some of the ones that are listed here, Denmark, Iceland, Japan. All right, because for the most part, there's not a whole lot of external or people migrating to these places. They might visit, there might be tourists, but for the most part, the majority of people living in these countries are Japanese, Danish, Icelandic. So that's why these are really good examples of a nation state. Now, we also have to continue this conversation with the idea of what we call self-determination. All right, and this is a topic that led to World War I in particular. So when we talked about, former Yugoslavia and, the Balkans, this was a very big player. And so the idea of self-determination is the idea that ethnicities have the right to govern themselves, that they have, as an ethnic group, the right to form their own government, run their own affairs, and have no outside foreign influence. They want to go live separately on their own. Okay, and so this is what led to World War I, when you had the Bosnian Serbs trying to, break off from the Austro-Hungarian Empire and join with Serbia. And that, again, is the big spark behind World War I and everything else behind it. And there was, little sparks, but that was the big thing that led to the assassination of the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, and then the beginning of World War I, and then, the creation of these more ethnic states, and just, different countries within Europe that have become more along the lines of nation states, over the last 100-ish years since then. All right, but it's also led to other, things within as well, including the Sudanese Civil War that led to the breakup of Sudan and South Sudan. Okay, then we have, when we talk about, when is it a state and when is it not, examples of stateless nations. And these, again, we referred to this a little bit within the ethnicity chapter, was groups of people who, are an ethnic group. They want self-determination, but do not have a country to call their own. All right, and, some of the examples, again, that we mentioned within that previous chapter, the Kurds. Okay, they are a stateless nation, a nation without government separated, or, amongst other countries like Armenia, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran. All right, they occupy all this physical space that are in pretty close proximity to each other, but again, amongst different countries, and don't have the right to govern themselves. Palestinians, while they're recognized territories, they do not have control over their foreign affairs or even in their internal affairs in some cases, as Israel, has much control over that. Again, while we didn't watch the movie this year, Tangerines, Ossetians and Abkhazians in the area of Georgia in the former Soviet Union, again, the Caucasus Mountain part of Europe, again, is another example of, a stateless nation, of ethnicities that want to have that self-determination but have not been granted that and are most likely not going to get it. All right, we might see that happen with the Kurds and hopefully with the Palestinians sometime soon. Now, the idea of a territory, because we talk about this, within these ones here, is an area of land under jurisdiction of a state or ruler, and I got that from, Merriam-Webster online. So we also have this with the definition of territoriality, okay, because this connects it back to the topic and conversation we have related to, nationalism and patriotism, going again back to the ethnicity chapter. So territoriality, think about this like a dog defending its territory. There's people's sense of attachment to an area leads them to defending that area. You're being territorial. You are defending what you believe to be your homeland, to be something that is important to you. So I always think about like a dog being territorial. It's marked its area and it's going to defend it. Okay, so this happens in territories, and it also happens within nation states and just states in general. So when people get territorial, that's what they want to defend. All right, and that again is another definition that's worth noting. All right, so we also want to consider that not every state is, a nation state. All right, because sometimes states get divided up into more than one country. When we look at the Koreas, we have North and South Korea as a result of World War II and the Korean War in the midst of the Cold War. All right, neither one are really, they kind of have like a very, very tense peace agreement that sort of recognize one another, but not really recognizing one another. All right, but they both control their own internal affairs. They both control their external affairs. But it also fits the idea of a shadow belt region, which we kind of mentioned, again, going back to the ethnicity chapter, as this is an area where you have conflicting conflicts within, or conflicting interests and abilities and, influences inside the region that was also being played out in the Cold War, because you have the U.S. focused on South Korea, and then you have China and the Soviet Union focusing on North Korea and supporting them in terms of influence and access. All right, within their different means, and it's kind of like what led to the conflict. All right, and so at the end of the day, they both want to come together, but neither one is going to give up on the other side. North Korea wants to impose its communist. It's not a communist country. It's just a purely dictatorship under Kim Jong-un and his family. So it's a monarchical one. And then you have the Democratic Republic in South Korea. I think it's a Democratic Republic, but anyway, some sort of democracy in South Korea that would like to impose it on North Korea, but aren't willing to go to war in order to do that. But they are controlling of their own affairs, for the most part. Okay, then we have China and Taiwan. Okay, so again, going back to the idea of shadow belt regions, going back to the Cold War, when China became a communist country in 1948, 1949, the democratic government at the time, again, it wasn't much of a democracy, it is now in Taiwan, the government leaders fled to the island of Taiwan, which was always a long time part of China over the last, 300-4-ish hundred years when they were conquered by one of the dynasties. So people within China, and we'll do a reading on this, they look at Taiwan as part of their territory, as part of their country, but they aren't able to go in and invade or take over because, again, it's backed by the United States and a bunch of other countries, while people in Taiwan have a bit difference of, like, I might have a Chinese ethnicity, but my country is Taiwan. All right, these are not the same places because of our, last 70-ish years of a separate history. All right, so, that's kind of the thing. If Taiwan initially called themselves the true rulers of China, but they were just in exile. That's kind of no longer the case. Or they were calling themselves really in exile. If you say otherwise, you're kind of living, or if you agree with that, you're kind of living in delusion that you're still in control of China. But yeah, China does not officially recognize it as a country. The United States kind of walks this fine line, as do a lot of other countries in the United Nations, because if you acknowledge that Taiwan is, its own separate country, the Chinese government gets offended by that. And you can look that up in terms of that tense situation. But also people in China, people within Taiwan, whether they call themselves Chinese or Taiwanese, it makes it more complicated based on, again, political affiliation. So again, that's one thing to really consider here, especially when we go back to those definitions of what's your nationality versus what's your ethnicity. Because again, those things can be very, very different. Like I myself, under these same circumstances, my ethnicity, going back to my cultural beliefs, you could say it's Jewish, it's German, it's Austro-Hungarian, Lithuanian, Polish, Russian. But my nationality is that of the United States. I was born and raised in America. So again, it becomes more complicated when you start throwing around these other disputes and other issues depending on where you live. Okay, so that brings us to this idea here of multi-ethnic and multinational states that we will revisit and expand upon heavily in the next video.